It was supposed to be an ordinary evening as 51-year-old Susan returned home after a busy shift at the hospital. She was looking forward to a quiet evening in her cozy home, which had always been a safe haven for her. But when she opened the door, she felt a strange unease. She saw a shadow in the dark hallway and realized she was not alone. At that moment, the world as she knew it collapsed. Suddenly, she was face to face with something she couldn't have imagined in her worst dreams. But in that very moment, she discovered a strength and courage within herself that she had never known before. Today, I will tell you the story of Susan Kuhnhausen, which is living proof that true heroism is born in the most difficult moments. Susan Kuhnhausen has been a nurse for 30 years. In 2006, when this story takes place, she was working in the emergency room at one of Portland's hospitals and was an important part of the team. She was very dedicated to her work and well liked by her colleagues. She was 51 years old, and people described her as an outgoing, always smiling, and sometimes a little loud lady who never complained about anything. On Wednesday, September 6th, Susan finished her 9-hour shift at the hospital and stopped at her favorite hair salon, Perfect Look, on her way home. She confided in the hairdresser that she was going through a divorce and needed a new color for her new life. Well, about an hour later, she was walking out with her hair a slightly different shade of brown. She got in her car and drove home. A few minutes after 6:30, Susan parked in front of her one-story house and walked in the back door. A note from her husband was waiting for her in the hallway. Yes, Susan was getting a divorce, but she maintained a friendly relationship with her soon-to-be ex-husband. He still came to the house sometimes, for example to look after her cats. The note said, "Sue, I can't sleep. I needed to get away. I went to the beach. See you Friday or Saturday." That struck Susan as a bit odd. Why had he gone to the beach if he couldn't sleep? But her husband was a bit moody and had his quirks, so she wasn't too surprised. It was part of the reason she wanted to divorce him. Susan read the note and then continued on into the house. She unlocked the kitchen door and the alarm started beeping, which is normal as it has to be deactivated when you arrive. So she deactivated the alarm and then went out the front door to get the mail. It was warm and sunny that day, so she stayed in the yard for a while and quietly went through her mail. After taking in the fresh air and flipping through a few letters, she went back inside. She kicked off her slippers and then something stopped her. The bedroom door was half open and the room looked dark, even though she had opened the curtains every morning to let the sun in. Telling herself that maybe she had forgotten today, she made her way towards the door when a stranger stepped out of it. He wore cotton trousers, a blue and white striped shirt, and a dark cap pulled low on his forehead. His long gray hair was sticking out from under the cap, tied in a ponytail. Perhaps the most frightening thing, though, was that he was wearing yellow dish gloves and holding a red and black carpenter's hammer. Susan exclaimed, "Who are you? What are you doing here? Get out of here!" But the man had no plans to leave. Instead, he swung the hammer and struck Susan on the head, then struck her temple once more. For most people, that would be the end of the story. But Susan was a tough woman. During her time at the hospital, she did things like open her chest during cardiac massage, administered infusions to patients who were reeling from drug withdrawal symptoms, and she and the other nurses regularly attended self-defense classes because, unfortunately, they also faced the possibility of being physically assaulted in the hospital. So they learned various moves and tricks for self-defense. Susan was in shock after the attack and had just received 2 blows with a giant hammer, but somehow a wave of adrenaline kicked in and she realized that this was no thief. This man was going to kill her. She assessed that it would be pointless to run because she was small. She was only 5 feet and 30 inches, 162 centimeters, and also had serious problems with her knees due to a previous injury. And her excess weight was only making it worse. Her attacker was almost 6 feet, 180 centimeters, and she would certainly not have been able to escape. But at that moment, her training clicked in her head, and instead of running away, she began to approach her attacker. This is something that is done in a fight to prevent the attacker from swinging and make it harder for him to land blows. Susan tried to knock the man to the ground, but he fought back and pinned her against the wall. Susan then began to struggle with him for the hammer, and during this the man said only 3 words to her: "You are strong," which he was right about, as Susan was a sturdy woman, used to physical labor, and outweighed her attacker by 32 kilograms or 70 pounds. Susan saw a mixture of surprise and delight in his eyes. She was absolutely sure he wanted to kill her, but she didn't know why. Suddenly the hammer fell to the ground and Susan quickly grabbed her attacker by the throat. With determination, she told him, "You will not kill me in my own home." She clasped her hands around his neck and saw the man begin to turn blue. She knew he would soon pass out. At that moment, she let go of him, grabbed the hammer, and began to beat him with it. Now, a little clarification. When the man hit her, he used the blunt side of the hammer, but Susan opted for the sharp part. At that moment, a memory flashed through her mind of her father advising her, way back in the 60s, that if someone broke into their house, she should use a carpenter's hammer and in particular the sharp side. So that was pretty specific advice, which came in handy now. I wondered why the man hadn't used the sharp side too, and all I could think was that he might have assumed it would be enough for Susan and didn't want her blood on him. Anyway, when Susan got hold of the hammer, she used just the sharp side and hit him about 3 or 4 times. Then she dropped the hammer and started running. But she only got a few steps before the man caught up with her, turned her around, and started punching her in the face. Her lip was torn, they were both bleeding, and Susan felt dizzy. Susan then dropped to the floor and kept her eyes on the phone, but knew she had no chance of getting to it. When she looked back at him, he had the hammer in his hand again and was bending over her. Susan knew she was in a bad position and that this would probably be the end of her. But she didn't want to give up. She grabbed his leg and somehow managed to pull him to the ground. With the fight on the ground, she could use her weight advantage. She tried to wrestle the hammer out of his hand, but couldn't. She was exhausted and began to scream. She hoped the neighbors would hear her. But her voice was weakening and her strength was leaving her. Finally, she thought that if she died, she would at least try to leave some traces on her attacker. She started biting him. First on the forearm, then the arm, the hip, the thigh, and even bit his genitals, hoping he'd drop the hammer. Then she started rummaging through his pockets, trying to find something, an ID, a key, a comb, just anything she could toss into the other room to leave some evidence. When she realized she'd never get the hammer, she figured she had to become a weapon herself. She wanted him to be as afraid of her as she was of him. She threw her left leg over his right, causing him to turn around and face the floor. His back was to her then, and she leaned forward, slid her left hand under his neck and began to strangle him from behind. She shouted at him, "Tell me who sent you here and I'll call an ambulance." She let go of him for a moment so he could breathe and talk, but he didn't answer. Instead, he tried with all his might to get her off his back. She knew that if he succeeded, she would be dead. Susan remembered a training session in which she had seen a police officer use a tranquilizer hold. Its purpose is to put enough pressure on both carotid arteries to restrict the blood supply to the brain, resulting in the attacker becoming temporarily unconscious. So that's exactly what she did. She held him tight and didn't let go until he stopped struggling and lost consciousness. Their entire fight lasted about 14 minutes. Susan's heart was racing and she felt like it was going to jump out of her chest. She grabbed the hammer, stood up and ran down the hallway, out through the living room and then to the neighbors. She pounded on the door and screamed to be let in. When they opened the door, they saw Susan in torn clothes, bruised and bloody. She told them she'd been attacked and may have killed the man. Her neighbor, Anne Warnock, immediately called the police and said there was an intruder in the house next door and her neighbor thought she had strangled him. She also said Susan was bleeding. The dispatcher asked her if she needed an ambulance and she replied, "No, she's a nurse, but she says the guy will need it. Maybe he's dead." She was then asked if the man was there alone, and she replied, "Yes," but Susan expressed concern that her husband may have sent him. So Susan obviously thought her husband had sent a hitman after her. Let's talk about who her husband was and why Susan thought that about him. His name was Michael Kuhnhausen, but everyone called him Mike. He was 58 years old, and he and Susan had been married for almost 18 years. Their relationship wasn't perfect, but Susan tried for a long time to make it work before she finally lost her temper and filed for divorce. She said her parents were also divorced, and their marriage was bad enough that she didn't really know what a healthy relationship was supposed to look like. Maybe that's why she had been single for a long time before. By the time she was 33, her mother and a friend were worried about her, so they paid for an ad in a newspaper dating site with good intentions. It was printed in early 1988, and Susan captioned it with the words, "Someone different." She went on to describe herself as follows: single white female, 33 years old, overweight but still full of life, looking for a single man who wants more from a relationship than just thinness. Active health professional who enjoys exploring the Northwest, interested in conversation, and good times spent with someone intelligent, considerate, and with a good sense of humor. Must be emotionally and financially mature. If you are looking for a cheerful and adventurous woman who is brave enough to submit this ad, please reply. And it wasn't long before Susan got a reply. Hi, different. My name is Mike. I'm 39 years old and I'm a divorced white guy. I like most things outdoors, from exploring lava caves near volcanic mountains to walking on the beach at sunset. On January 30th, 1988, the two called each other for the first time, and Susan had a really good feeling about Mike. She liked his voice, and she also felt that he was emotionally mature, which was something she mentioned in the ad. They talked about deep things and topics that were meaningful to her. Mike told her that he had fought in Vietnam and was now working as a maintenance man. He had already been married once and had 2 children. However, he was not afraid to fall in love again. Their relationship deepened. They called each other regularly until finally, after about a month, they met for the first time. They didn't even know what each other looked like until then, but they hit it off immediately. They started dating, going for walks in the countryside, and everything was fine. It was so good, in fact, that within a year they had a wedding in Reno, a town in Nevada known as Little Las Vegas because of its many casinos and entertainment venues. Susan said they chose this location because, what's a bigger bet in life than marriage? She was very proud of herself for having the courage to get married, even after how many failed relationships she saw around her. They moved into a house together in Portland, which they started paying off, and things went pretty well at first. Mike was an introvert, unlike Susan, and eventually wanted to spend more and more time at home, so their walks became more and more sporadic. But he didn't mind Susan going out with friends because she was really a very social person. Mike and Susan didn't have any children together, but Mike's children from his first marriage came to visit them every other weekend, and Susan adored them. They were happy that way, plus they both spent a lot of time at work. By the way, sometime during their marriage, Mike started working at a new place. He became a cleaning and maintenance supervisor at Fantasy Adult Video, which operated a VHS tape and later DVD rental business for adult films. They were happy for about 13 years, but something changed in the last 5 years. Mike had become very interested in the amounts Susan spent when she went out with friends, whether it was dinners, movies, or other such things. He wanted to know about everything and was angry with her for spending so much on silly things. Susan was a little confused about this because she always earned more than him and finances were never an issue for them. However, she soon noticed other changes in Mike's behavior. He seemed to be getting more and more negative and even told Susan that he wasn't sure if he was ever really happy. He said he didn't know what happiness actually meant. He described life as a shit sandwich that you take a bite out of every day until you die. When Mike wasn't at work, he just sat at home, smoking cigarette after cigarette and drinking Diet Coke. He paid no attention to Susan. He seemed to be in a depression that was deepening. Susan's brother talked to Mike and then told Susan that his behavior was consistent with symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, a problem that affects many war veterans. A year before Susan was attacked, she was already at the end of her rope. She pleaded with Mike to start attending therapy with her, but he wouldn't, telling her that therapy was what sealed his first divorce. Susan, however, insisted that something had to change and basically gave Mike an ultimatum. Either you go to therapy and work on our relationship, or I'm getting a divorce. Eventually, Mike reluctantly agreed, but in therapy, he kept blaming everything on Susan. There was no significant improvement. When Mike was home, he completely disengaged. He would just sit and smoke cigarettes. So in September 2005, they agreed to a trial separation. Mike moved in with his father, but they still maintained a friendly relationship. By now, Mike's children were grown up, but for a change, his grandchildren were visiting them again. So when the children were there, they both tried to function normally together under the same roof and continued family activities. Susan had only one request for Mike, and that was that he not come into the house when she wasn't there. She had a sneaking suspicion that Mike was going in there and going through her things. As Christmas approached, Susan invited a few friends over to her house and threw a small party. Then Mike suddenly appeared out of nowhere, standing off to the side, and her friends noticed that he was watching Susan strangely, as if he was angry with her. They described his gaze as frightening. By January 2006, Susan knew that her 18-year marriage to Mike was coming to an end. They had been apart for almost 6 months, but they were still seeing each other. Mike came and went, sometimes stayed overnight, and even knew the code to the alarm. Susan didn't feel the need to change it, and besides, the code was their anniversary date, 12/10. Susan was already determined to get a divorce, even though Mike kept urging her to give it another try. He was even willing to attend therapy again, but Susan was no longer interested. She felt much better after their separation. Mike's life, on the other hand, was starting to fall apart. He lost his job, told Susan he was laid off, and at the same time his father decided to sell his house. Mike was upset about that because it was his childhood home, and Susan felt like it all came crashing down on him at once. He looked pretty desperate. But she still had the feeling that Mike was coming into the house when she wasn't there. She thought he was probably trying to figure out what was going on in her life without him. Her suspicions were so strong that she even called the company she got the alarm from and asked if anyone had entered the house on a certain day. But they told her that no one had come in, so she figured she must just have a vivid imagination. In the late summer of 2006, Susan separated their bank accounts and proceeded with the divorce process. Then, just about a week later, on September 6th, she was attacked in her home. So now we return to the day of the attack. Susan was waiting at a neighbor's house, and soon the police and an ambulance turned up and took a battered Susan to hospital, the same hospital where she herself worked. Meanwhile, the police entered her house and found a man lying dead on the floor, just as Susan had described. Unfortunately, he was beyond help. In his trouser pocket, they found a wallet with his ID. The man was identified as Edward Dalton Haffey. He was 50 years old, also a Vietnam War veteran, and had a long criminal record. The police first assumed he was in the house to rob it, but Susan interrupted him. This was indicated by the weapon used. The hammer actually belonged to Susan, who had recently used it and left it laying in the bathroom. So even though Susan said that her husband could have sent the man after her, they figured that the hitman would probably have brought his own weapon. However, the strange thing was that there was no sign of forced entry into the house, and the alarm hadn't even been set off. And only 2 people knew the code, Susan and Mike. Meanwhile, Susan was in hospital, where her best friend Helene visited her. She said Susan looked terrible. She had bumps all over her head and a big gash on her lip, bruises on her face, and teeth marks on her arms. Susan asked Helen, "Do you think it could be Mike?" She replied that she couldn't imagine Mike hiring a hitman after 18 years of marriage. The media picked up the case that day and reported it as a complete sensation, a middle-aged woman who had managed to overpower her attacker. Her neighbor Anne gave an interview to the newspaper in which she said, "Everyone I've talked to says one thing, hooray for Susan. I didn't even have to reassure her, she's an emergency room nurse, she's used to dealing with crises." So Susan became an overnight hero, but she was ambivalent. On the one hand, she was proud that she had defended herself, but on the other hand, she felt bad because she had killed someone. even though that person had attacked her. She also didn't know what that meant under the law. Would she have to prove in court that she hadn't lured this man to her house to kill him? She'd hired a lawyer that day just to be sure. Miraculously, her injuries were not too serious, and the very next day she and Helene went back to their house. There she found many messages on her answering machine from people wishing her a speedy recovery. And there was even one message from Mike, but he didn't sound at all shocked by what had happened. He sounded perfectly normal, just left a short message and that was it. But Mike was the kind of person, according to Susan, who would get upset over the smallest things. And now that his wife had almost been murdered, he sounded completely cold. Anyway, Susan had come to the house mainly to pack up some things and move in with Helene for a while, because she was afraid to stay there. But while packing, they found a backpack in the basement that Susan had never seen. Although the police searched the house, they must have overlooked this backpack because the basement was overflowing with stuff. The backpack contained several items: a bottle of Hershey's syrup, $200 in cash, some diabetes pills, a diary, and a pay stub in Ed Haffey's name. The syrup and diabetes pills probably meant he had something sweet on him in case his sugar level got too low, for a quick refill. But Susan was mainly interested in the diary. When she opened it, she found an entry from September 4th that said, "Call Mike, get a letter." And it also listed Mike's phone number. So it was a clear connection. Susan then brought the whole backpack to the police, and when she handed it over, they gave her the results of the toxicology tests. They found that Haffey had a very high, near-fatal dose of cocaine in his system, which means, among other things, that he may have been more aggressive, more resistant in a fight, and may have had a reduced perception of pain. The police also went to the place where Haffey was staying, his trailer on Killingsworth Street, which is quite a telling name. They found some of his relatives and friends, and they said that Haffey grew up in an upper-middle-class family and was an avid tennis player in his youth. However, he met the wrong people and went into the path of crime. Most of his records were related to drug dealing, but there were also burglaries and physical assaults. But Ed Haffey's most horrific crime was committed 15 years ago, in 1991. That's when he and a few other people plotted the murder of his ex-girlfriend named Georgia Dutton to keep her from telling the police about their drug dealings. Although Haffey was not present during the actual execution of the murder, he gave his consent and participated in the planning. So human life certainly meant nothing to him, and the possibility that he was hired to kill Susan seemed very real. Haffey confessed to his involvement in this crime in 1994 and spent the next 9 years in prison. He was released on November 3, 2003, less than 3 years before Susan was attacked. After his release, he moved to Portland and needed a job. He finally found one in July 2004 when he was hired as a janitor for Fantasy Adult Video. And the man who recruited him was Mike Kuhnhausen. So all indications were that Mike hired a subordinate with a criminal history to kill his wife. Of course, the police wanted to talk to Mike the whole time, but he just kind of disappeared. They got hold of his financial records, and they showed that on the day of the murder, he was staying at the Lincoln City Inn, which was on the coast, so that was probably the beach he was talking about. I guess he wanted to be around people to have an alibi. But the next day he returned to Portland and bought a $400 Taurus Magnum revolver at a pawn shop. Then on September 8th, Mike left messages at the home of his father and his daughter Angela. These messages seemed like suicide notes, as if he was about to take his own life. He wrote, among other things, that all he ever wanted was to be loved. But every time he had that, he blew it. And then he left and nobody saw him again. A week later, at 10 a.m. on September 14th, Mike was finally found and apprehended in another Oregon town in the parking lot of Kaiser Sunnyside Medical Center. Mike told police he was going to be hospitalized there for mental health issues. He said he had nothing left to live for. However, Mike did not end up in the hospital, and instead was taken to the police station for questioning. There, he said he had nothing to do with the attack, that he had been at the beach that day and didn't know any Ed Haffey. He also said that he had lost his job a few weeks ago and had no place to live, and that is what caused his mental problems. Finally, he also said that he had no reason to kill Susan because she had changed the terms of her life insurance policy so that her brother was the sole beneficiary, and he knew it. However, the truth was that they had a house worth $300,000 paid off, and it would all go to him. The detective then showed Mike records that he and Haffey had worked together, and Mike eventually admitted under the weight of the evidence that he knew him. But he still maintained that he hadn't done anything, and just because he knew the guy didn't mean he did this. But the police had other evidence. They told him the alarm had been deactivated while Susan was at work, and he admitted he was there, but said he'd just left a note for Susan saying he was going to the beach. He denied letting Haffey into the house. The strange thing, however, was that there were no keys to the house found in Haffey's pockets or backpack, so it was unclear how he would have gotten there on his own. There was ample evidence against Mike, and he was therefore charged with conspiracy to murder and placed in custody. Pictures of his face then appeared all over the media, which eventually led to several important witnesses contacting the police. The first was Haffey's friend Barry Summers, with whom Haffey once served time in prison. Barry said that Haffey asked him to help him with a job, meaning something illegal, for which he promised a $5,000 reward. He told him that if he was interested, he would set up a meeting with another man, and he would explain everything to him. So they met, and Haffey brought the man who told him he would pay him $5,000 if he helped Haffey kill his wife. And of course, it was Mike. Barry refused the offer. He said he wasn't interested, and even if he was, it certainly wouldn't be worth $5,000. However, he didn't tell the police at the time. Another witness was a man named Harold Jones, who said he had driven Haffey to the parking lot of Applebee's restaurant a few days before the assault. There, Haffey met a bald man whom he later recognized on television, and it was Mike again. Haffey then told him that the man wanted to pay him $50,000 to kill his wife. So Haffey's been talking to a lot of people. The next witness the police found was a woman named Laurie Grabdahl, who was a friend of Haffey's and also his dealer. Laurie eventually admitted to police that Haffey was a regular customer of hers, and also bragged to her that someone had hired him to kill his wife. He was supposed to get a total of $50,000 for it, $25,000 up front and $25,000 later when her husband got his hands on the money. So all was pretty clear. Police told the media that Mike probably not only paid Haffey to kill his wife, but also let him into the house that day. The whole thing was supposed to look like a home invasion that ended badly. However, police believed the real motive was the money and property Mike would have received if his wife had died. Authorities also told the media that Susan was acting in lawful self-defense and her case, that she killed someone, won't even make it to a jury. She was acquitted of all charges. But who, on the other hand, was awaiting trial was Mike, who pleaded not guilty at a preliminary hearing. His bail was set at $500,000. And this is where it gets interesting, because Mike's two children, Angela and Michael Jr., are entering the picture. Angela was 27 and Michael Jr. was 33. It was reported that they both continued to be in contact with Susan, who continued to babysit their children, that is, Mike's grandchildren, even after Mike's arrest. So that would suggest that his children are more likely to side with her and not support their father. However, the opposite was true, because the two were trying to get him home on bail at all costs. Only they didn't have enough money, even though they were only required to pay 10% of that amount, $50,000. They would have to pay the rest of the money if Mike violated the terms of his bail. For example, if he failed to appear in court or traveled somewhere. So they didn't have enough money, and that's why they came up with the plan. They took Mike's father, whose name was Woodrow Kuhnhausen, and he was 94 years old. They took him to the bank, and they wanted him to take out a loan in his name and guarantee it with his house, which he still hadn't sold, but was about to. However, there was some trouble at the bank, and the loan was refused. Well, several witnesses then saw Michael Jr. berating his grandfather and yelling at him for being stupid and an idiot. This outcome did not escape the prosecutors, who thoroughly investigated the situation and then asked that the bail be raised to $2 million. They found that the teller at the bank immediately recognized Grandpa Woodrow because he knew that his family had tried to financially abuse him in the past. He told them that the loan application would take at least 4 days to process, whereupon Michael Jr. left to make some phone calls. After his grandson left, Woodrow told the teller that he is selling his house and that when he sells it, he plans to pay off this loan with the money. The teller replied that this was not how this type of loan worked. They all left after that, and Michael Jr. berated his grandfather, saying that he ruined everything and didn't believe it, that he just didn't shut up. Michael Jr. testified at trial and admitted he was a little angry, but said he was only yelling at Grandpa because he was deaf. He also said that the previous financial abuse mentioned was from his sister. Susan also spoke in court and said she was very concerned for her safety if Mike were to be released. Bail was eventually raised to $2 million. At the next hearing, the testimony of a new witness was introduced, who was a friend of Angela's. That is, a friend of Mike's daughter. He stated that Mike confided in him and complained that he could not afford to lose everything as he had in the last divorce. And then he said that if anyone was willing to kill his wife, he would reward them handsomely, which could be interpreted to mean that he was subtly trying to see if she would do it for him. The prosecutor then read Angela's testimony that she too had seen her father with Haffey just days before the attack. Mike's counsel, on the other hand, argued that there was very little connection between him and Haffey, and there was no evidence that Mike let the attacker into the house that day. He also said his entire interrogation was illegal, because Mike was arrested on information that he had a gun and wanted to take his own life. Officially, he was detained for his own protection, but instead of being taken to the hospital, he was questioned for several hours. So, in his opinion, nothing Mike said in that interrogation should be used in court. Susan also spoke up again and said that if Mike was released, she would have to go into hiding for fear of her life. She said she celebrated her 18th wedding anniversary alone, knowing that her husband was going to have her murdered. The judge eventually ruled that bail would be reduced to $1 million because Mike didn't have the means to pay it anyway. Well, he was wrong. Because at the end of 2006, Angela came in with an envelope and paid the mandatory 10%, $100,000. So Mike should have been released after the New Year's long weekend. It's believed Angela got the money from her grandfather, who finally managed to sell the house for $260,000. Angela said, "I love my father and he's innocent." So yes, Angela was acting as a witness who saw the two men together before the murder, but she was still on his side and believed in his innocence. The plan was for Mike to stay with his son after his release and be monitored by a GPS ankle bracelet. He would only be allowed to leave the house when he went to court or to see his lawyer. After New Year's, the day came for Mike to be released. He walked through the prison lobby past a group of reporters ready to become a free man again. He wore blue jeans and a white t-shirt. But then something went wrong. When he got to the office, he was told there was a problem. The owner of the apartment complex where his son lived had refused to let Mike move in, so he was out of luck. Mike wanted to stay with his daughter instead, but that was also denied because she was a witness in the case. In the end, Mike had nowhere to go and was taken back to his cell. As he walked past the reporters, he said, "I didn't do it." So in the end, Mike stayed in custody the whole time, waiting for the main trial. However, just days before it was due to start, in August 2007, Mike struck a plea bargain and confessed to hiring Haffey to kill Susan. Susan arrived at that hearing accompanied by her brother and friends. She knew what was going to happen that day because prosecutors had consulted with her about the wording of the plea agreement. After the trial, she told reporters that she was pleased with the outcome and that the fact that her husband had publicly confessed brought her peace. Still, she feels as if she herself has received 3 life sentences. The first punishment, she said, is that the man she loved and lived with for 17 years wanted to see her dead. The second punishment is that she had to take the life of another human being. And the third punishment is the knowledge that as long as her husband is alive, she will be in danger. In early September, sentencing took place and Mike was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Susan was in court again, accompanied by her mother, brother, and several friends. 4 of them spoke about how Susan had lost her sparkle, her appetite for life, and her loud laughter after the attack. They said her personality had changed, she was more anxious and very sensitive to her surroundings. Susan herself then gave a long speech, during which she described publicly for the first time how the fight had gone. She also said that it was ironic that Mike, who had also berated her when she hired a repairman, was now willing to pay $50,000 for something he himself was too much of a coward to do. She stated that if she believed Mike deserved to die, she would have at least had the balls to do it herself. Mike had earlier told police that he had not come to see his wife when he saw the report on TV because he saw that she was fine. Susan has now pulled out photos of her injuries and her bruised face in court and started showing them one by one. She said, "These are pictures of me from my own emergency room. Do I look okay? I'm hurt by what you did to me, but I'm not destroyed." In the end, Susan told Mike that she blames Haffey to some extent for what he did to her, but she blames him more. Then Mike got a chance to speak too, and he sobbed and said only one sentence: "I hurt a lot of people last year, and I'm sorry." After the trial was over, Susan hugged the prosecutor and then turned to her friends and asked them if they were going to lunch now. She told reporters that she felt great. So the ending is good, all good. But in real life, it's not that simple. Susan survived the attack, but she was traumatized. She's become very anxious, always worried that she's being watched, and she's taking all sorts of security precautions because of it. For example, she always rides in her car locked and with the windows rolled up, and she often changes her regular routes so that her behavior is not predictable. She's also moved to another house in Portland, on a cul-de-sac. She has gravel strewn around her house so she can hear if anyone walks by. She also installed cameras, got a gun, and goes to the shooting range a lot. Her biggest fear was that Mike could somehow recruit someone from prison who could hurt her. Maybe a fellow inmate who'd tell him he'd just sent the wrong guy after her. So Susan filed a civil suit against Mike, seeking a $1 million settlement. She won that lawsuit, saying that even though she'll probably never see the money, she did it mainly so that Mike would never have enough money to hire another killer. In 2008, Susan was awarded the Medal of Civilian Heroism by the Portland Police Department for her unwavering determination to survive. At the time, Susan wondered, "Am I a hero for killing a man?" But her supervisor at the hospital explained that people don't call her a hero because she killed a man, but because they want to believe that under the same circumstances, they also could have managed to survive. At that moment, Susan realized what an inspiration she could be to others and became active in supporting victims of crime. For many years, she attended self-defense classes where she told her story and inspired people not to underestimate themselves and to fight hard for their lives. In addition, Susan also returned to her work at the hospital, and her personality and laughter slowly returned. But then came the shock. Mike's sentence was reduced by 2 years for good behavior, and he was due to be released in September 2014, causing Susan renewed anxiety. She had bad dreams again and became paranoid. In the end, however, Mike did not see his freedom. 3 months before his release date, he died from health complications related to his prostate cancer. Although he had previously confessed in court, Mike claimed his innocence until his death and pleaded guilty only to receive a lighter sentence. Which would certainly be an interesting plot if Susan had orchestrated the whole thing herself and then framed him. Except there were a lot of witnesses that both men talked about it in front of. As for Susan, she left her job at the hospital in 2014, but continued to speak at self-defense classes and give motivational speeches. She is quite active on the internet and goes by the nickname Susan Walters on Reddit, which is her new last name, which she took after her grandmother because she didn't want to take her ex-husband's last name anymore. For a while, she also considered calling herself Susan Strong, taking inspiration from the words Haffey said to her during their fight, right before he died. Susan loves to discuss her case on Reddit, and every time someone shares her story, she pops up in the comments. Basically, she recommends that everyone there take self-defense classes, and occasionally she'll reveal an interesting tidbit. For example, she mentioned that Hafi's aunt sent her a letter saying that no one in her family held any grudges against her because she only did what she had to do. She also spoke to Georgia Dutton's daughter, who was the woman Hafi was involved in murdering. Her daughter Susan said it was his karma that Hafi eventually died at the hands of a woman. She believes Georgia was standing in the hallway cheering Susan on. Next, Susan shared a story from working in the ER. There was an aggressive patient who was swearing at the staff and throwing things at them. As security was taking him away, he yelled at Susan that he could easily break her neck. Susan replied, "Maybe you should Google me first." And when the door slammed behind him, the entire staff burst into laughter. Susan has also been saying on Reddit for about 7 years now that she's been writing a book about her experiences and that she's going to publish it soon. But it hasn't happened yet. In 2023, she shared on her Facebook page that she had been diagnosed with a malignant tumor and was undergoing chemotherapy. However, she is still alive. And in September this year, she wrote that she had just started her 18th bonus year, as she calls each year after the attack in which she was supposed to die. And that's really all for today's case. I think Susan Kuhnhausen's story is not only fascinating, but also deeply inspiring. It shows us how an ordinary person can discover incredible strength and courage in the most difficult of moments that they may not have known they had. If you are intrigued by Susan's story, I'd love for you to share your thoughts in the comments. And for now, thank you for visiting my channel, and I hope to see you soon again.